"You will never be enough for this family." Those were the words Rafael wasn't supposed to hear. For 3 years, his wife suffered in silence behind closed doors, swallowing humiliation while he built an empire far from home. But one cancelled flight, one early return, changed everything. What he heard behind that door would shatter everything he believed about his own family and about the woman he thought he knew. Before we begin, I need to tell you something. I created Allure TV especially for those of you who follow me here, and there's content on there that this platform would never allow. Uncensored stories, with no cuts and no ads. You'll find everything: steamy stories, mafia stories, billionaire romances, and many more genres that you're going to love. There's new content every day for you to listen to in multiple languages or read whenever you prefer. This channel no longer generates any revenue for me, but I have an amazing team that works hard every week for all of you. The people who join Allure TV are the ones who keep all of this alive, and they get a lot in return. The link is pinned in the comments, or you can simply point your camera at the QR code on the screen. May God bless each and every one of you, wishing you many blessings in your lives. The house on Maple Ridge Avenue looked like something out of a magazine. Tall windows, manicured hedges, a fountain that caught the morning light just right. To anyone driving past, it was the picture of a life well built. And in many ways, it was. Rafael Montero had spent the last decade turning a modest logistics company into an empire that stretched across 3 states. He was respected in boardrooms, admired by colleagues, and, when he was actually present, deeply loving toward his wife. The problem was the word present. It had become a rare visitor in his own home. Luiza remembered exactly when the silence started. It wasn't a single moment, but a slow erosion, like water wearing down stone until the shape of something was gone and nobody could quite remember what it used to look like. She had married Rafael believing that love was enough to carry them through anything, through his long hours, through the pressure of his growing company, through the fact that his mother, Beatrice, had never once looked at her with anything resembling warmth. "You're up early," Beatrice said one morning, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, her silk robe pulled tight around her thin frame. Her eyes swept over Luiza's chipped mug, her disheveled hair, the way she leaned against the counter like she belonged there. "I couldn't sleep," Luiza answered quietly, not meeting her mother-in-law's gaze. "Of course you couldn't. Guilt has a way of keeping people awake." Beatrice said it lightly, almost like a joke, the way she said most of her cruelties, dressed up as concern, wrapped in a tone so smooth it took years for Luiza to understand what she was actually hearing. "I don't understand what I've done wrong." "You've done nothing," Beatrice replied, moving toward the coffee pot as though the conversation bored her. "That's precisely the problem, isn't it? You occupy a house, you occupy a name, but occupying isn't the same as belonging." Luiza said nothing. She had learned over 3 years that responding only gave Beatrice more to work with, more silences to fill with implications, more pauses to load with meaning. So she stood there, coffee cooling in her hands, and let the words settle into her chest where so many others already lived. That evening, when Rafael finally came home, later than he'd promised, his tie loosened, his eyes tired from another 12-hour day, Luiza tried again. She always tried again, even when some small, exhausted part of her already knew how it would end. "Your mother said something to me this morning," she began, sitting across from him at the kitchen island while he loosened his cufflinks. "What did she say?" Rafael asked, though his tone carried the particular flatness of a man already bracing for a conversation he didn't want to have. "She said I don't belong here, that I occupy space, but I don't belong to this family." Rafael sighed, rubbing his temple. "Luiza, please. My mother says things. She's blunt, she's old-fashioned, but she doesn't mean—" "She means it," Luiza interrupted, her voice trembling in a way she hated, because it made her sound weak when all she wanted was to be believed. "Rafael, she means every word. She raised me alone after my father's accident. She sacrificed everything. I know she can be difficult, but cruel." He shook his head, something between disbelief and defensiveness hardening his expression. "That's not the woman I know." "Maybe that's not the woman you know," Luiza said softly, "but it's the only version of her I've ever met." Rafael reached for her hand across the counter, his fingers warm against hers, and for a moment she let herself believe that this time would be different, that he would ask more questions, that he would truly listen instead of simply waiting for his turn to defend his mother. But instead, he just squeezed her hand gently and said, "I'll talk to her. I promise." He never did. Or if he did, nothing changed. The comments continued, smaller sometimes, sharper others, always delivered when Rafael wasn't around to witness them, always denied or softened whenever Luiza brought them up. Over time, she stopped bringing them up at all. She told herself it wasn't worth the argument, wasn't worth watching Rafael's face shift into that particular expression of doubt, as if he were trying to decide whether his wife was exaggerating or his mother was truly capable of such things. The nights grew quieter between them, not peaceful, quiet in the way a house grows quiet before a storm, the kind of silence that isn't rest but retreat. Luiza began eating her breakfast before Beatrice woke. She began finding reasons to be out of the house during the hours her mother-in-law usually roamed it. She built a small, careful life around avoidance, and somewhere in that process, she stopped waiting for Rafael to notice. It wasn't that she loved him less. If anything, watching him leave each morning with his briefcase and his confident stride made something in her chest ache with a love that felt almost inconvenient now. A love that asked nothing of him, because she'd learned that asking only led to disappointment. She used to believe silence was surrender. Now she understood it differently. Silence, she had discovered, hurt less than speaking and not being believed. What Luiza didn't know, what she couldn't have known sitting at that kitchen island night after night, was that a single cancelled flight was about to unravel 3 years of carefully guarded silence in a single afternoon. And the man who had spent so long refusing to see the truth was about to walk straight into it. Rafael's flight to Chicago was supposed to depart at 6 in the morning. He had packed the night before, kissed Luiza's forehead while she slept, and left before sunrise with his suitcase wheels echoing against the marble entryway. It was a routine so familiar it barely registered anymore. Another trip, another negotiation, another 48 hours away from the house on Maple Ridge Avenue. He was already through security when the call came. Mechanical failure, the airline said. All flights grounded until further notice, possibly rescheduled for the following morning. Rafael stood in the terminal for a long moment, phone pressed to his ear, feeling something between irritation and, strangely, relief. It had been weeks since he'd had an unplanned afternoon. Weeks since he'd walked through his own front door without an agenda waiting on the other side of it. He didn't call ahead. He liked the idea of surprising Luiza, bringing her flowers maybe, or suggesting they get lunch somewhere quiet, just the two of them, the way they used to before his calendar swallowed every free hour they had. He drove home with the windows cracked, the radio low, allowing himself something he rarely permitted anymore: anticipation. The house was quiet when he stepped inside, his shoes silent against the hardwood. He set his suitcase down in the foyer, already composing in his mind how he'd tease Luiza about being caught off guard. But as he moved toward the kitchen, voices reached him. His mother's voice, sharp and deliberate, carrying from the sitting room just beyond the hallway. "You really thought a ring would make you one of us?" Beatrice's tone was almost amused, the cruelty folded so casually into her words that it took Rafael a moment to understand what he was hearing. "Rafael built everything you're standing in. You've contributed nothing. You occupy his home the way a guest overstays a welcome. Polite enough not to be thrown out, but never truly invited." Rafael froze at the edge of the hallway, one hand against the cool plaster of the wall. "I've tried," Luiza's voice answered, and something in Rafael's chest cracked at the sound of it. Thin, worn down, stripped of the fire he used to know in her. "I've tried for 3 years to be someone you could accept." "Trying isn't the same as belonging," Beatrice replied, echoing words she'd clearly used before, words worn smooth from repetition. "You'll never carry this family's name the way it deserves to be carried. You're a placeholder, Luiza, a temporary arrangement until Rafael realizes what he actually needs." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Rafael had ever heard. He pictured Luiza's face without needing to see it. The careful stillness she wore like armor, the way her hands would be folded tightly in her lap, the way she wouldn't cry, not in front of Beatrice, because crying would be a victory handed over freely. He stepped into the doorway. Both women turned. Beatrice's expression shifted instantly, smoothing into something composed, almost welcoming. "Rafael, you're home early. We thought, how long has this been happening?" His voice came out low, unfamiliar even to himself. "Darling, it's nothing. We were simply—" "How long, Mai?" He looked past her now, toward Luiza, whose eyes had gone wide with something between fear and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite trust that he was actually standing there, actually asking. Luiza said nothing. She'd learned, after all, that silence hurt less than speaking and not being believed. But Rafael saw it now. Really saw it. The exhaustion carved into the lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders curved inward, as if she'd spent years trying to take up less space in her own home. She wore a soft, rose-colored sweater that seemed to swallow her, too big, too careful, like even her clothing had learned to apologize for existing. "Say something," he said gently, crossing the room toward her. "Please." "What is there to say?" Luiza's voice cracked on the last word. "I told you. I told you so many times, Rafael, and you always found a reason to believe her instead of me." "I know." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "I know, and I'm sorry, and none of that undoes what I just heard. Does it?" Beatrice stepped forward, her composure cracking at the edges. "You're going to take her side over your own mother's, after everything I've sacrificed for this family? This isn't about sides." Rafael turned to face her fully now, something cold and unfamiliar settling into his voice. "This is about the woman I married being humiliated in her own home for 3 years while I was too blind or too much of a coward to believe it was happening." "Rafael, I heard you, Mai." His voice dropped quieter now, more devastating for its restraint. "I heard every word." The room fell into a silence unlike any before it. Not the practiced, careful silence Luiza had built her days around, but something raw and unfinished, crackling with everything that had gone unsaid for years. Beatrice's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in longer than Rafael could remember, his mother had nothing to say. Luiza stood frozen by the window, watching her husband's face shift through disbelief, guilt, and something that looked dangerously close to grief. Grief for the years he hadn't protected her. Grief for the marriage he thought he'd been building, while she quietly crumbled beside him. "Luiza." He said her name like an apology and a question at once. "I need you to know that I—" "Not now." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of every silenced morning, every swallowed word. "I can't do this right now." She walked past him, past Beatrice, out of the room that had witnessed so much of her pain, leaving both of them standing in the wreckage of a truth that could no longer be unheard. Rafael watched her go, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, understanding with sudden, sickening clarity that hearing the truth and earning back trust were two entirely different battles, and he had only just begun the first one. The family dinner had been planned for weeks, a gathering to celebrate the company's newest expansion, complete with relatives, business partners, and the kind of forced elegance Beatrice insisted upon whenever the Montero name was on display. Luiza had almost refused to attend. After the conversation Rafael overheard 3 days earlier, the idea of sitting at that long dining table, smiling for people who had watched her be diminished for years without ever intervening, felt like its own kind of cruelty. But Rafael asked her to come, not demanded, asked in a voice so different from the one she'd grown used to that it startled her into agreeing. "I need you there," he'd said, standing in the doorway of their bedroom, his tie already loosened even though the evening hadn't started. "Not to pretend everything is fine, just to know that I finally see you." The dining room glowed with warm amber light, the long table set with white linen and porcelain, relatives scattered across a dozen conversations at once. Luiza wore a deep wine-red dress that felt like armor, her hair pulled back, her expression composed in a way that had taken years to perfect. She sat beside Rafael, aware of Beatrice's eyes finding her across the table more than once, sharp and assessing. It was during the second course, as an uncle raised a toast to the company's success, that Beatrice leaned toward a cousin and murmured something just loud enough to carry. It's remarkable, isn't it, how some people manage to sit at tables they were never meant to belong to. The table didn't fall silent. Most guests hadn't heard, too absorbed in their own conversations. But Rafael heard, his fork stilled against his plate. Luiza's hand resting on her lap curled slightly into the fabric of her dress, a small private flinch that she'd trained herself to hide from everyone, except, apparently, him. He set down his fork with deliberate calm. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut cleanly through the layered chatter, and one by one conversations began to falter as attention shifted toward him. Would you like to say that again? Louder this time, so everyone can hear exactly what you think of my wife. Beatrice's smile flickered. Rafael, darling, it was only a joke. It wasn't a joke 3 days ago, when I stood outside the sitting room and heard you tell Luiza she was nothing more than a placeholder in this family. His voice carried now, deliberate and steady, reaching every corner of the table. Forks paused mid-air. An aunt's glass hovered near her lips, forgotten. It wasn't a joke for 3 years, apparently, while I was too absorbed in building this company to notice what was happening in my own home. Rafael, please, this isn't the place. Beatrice's composure cracked, her hands fluttering toward the necklace at her throat. This is exactly the place. He stood now, one hand resting briefly on the back of Luiza's chair, a gesture so small and so deliberate that Luiza felt it like a current running through her spine. Because everyone at this table has watched my wife be humiliated for years and said nothing. So now everyone will hear this instead. No one, not you, not anyone bearing this family's name, will speak to Luiza that way again. A cousin near the end of the table shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. Beatrice's face had gone pale, her earlier composure replaced by something brittle and defensive. "How dare you humiliate me in front of everyone?" she said, her voice rising, tears gathering with suspicious speed at the corners of her eyes. "After everything I sacrificed, raising you alone, building this family's name from nothing, and this is how you repay me, taking her side in front of everyone?" "I'm not taking a side, man." Rafael's voice softened only slightly, though the steel beneath it remained. "I'm telling the truth, something I should have done 3 years ago." Beatrice looked around the table, searching for allies, for the sympathy she'd always been able to summon so effortlessly. But the room had gone quiet in a different way now, not the polite silence of avoided conflict, but something heavier, more uncertain, as relatives exchanged glances that suggested some of them, perhaps, had suspected more than they'd ever said aloud. Luiza sat very still through all of it, her heart hammering, her eyes fixed on the white linen tablecloth in front of her. Part of her wanted to feel triumphant, vindicated, finally, after years of being told she was imagining things, exaggerating, too sensitive. But a larger part of her felt strangely hollow. She looked up at Rafael, standing there defending her at last, and felt something complicated rise in her chest, gratitude tangled with a grief she couldn't quite name, because it had taken 3 years, and an accidental overheard conversation for him to finally believe her. "Luiza," Rafael turned to her, his expression soft now, searching. "I should have done this a long time ago. I'm sorry it took me this long." She managed a small nod, her throat too tight for words. Around them, the dinner had effectively ended. Beatrice had risen from the table, muttering something about being disrespected in her own home, disappearing toward the hallway with a few sympathetic relatives trailing after her. Others remained, unsure whether to continue eating or excuse themselves from what had clearly become a private matter made painfully public. Later that night, driving home in silence, Rafael reached over and took Luiza's hand. "I meant every word back there," he said quietly. "I'm going to make this right." Luiza looked out the window, watching the streetlights blur past, and said nothing for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something final in it that made Rafael's chest tighten. "I believe that you mean it, Rafael." She turned to look at him then, her eyes glistening but her voice unwavering. but meaning it isn't the same as 3 years of silence undoing itself in one dinner. He held her hand tighter, unsure for the first time in a long while whether he was already losing her, even as he'd finally found the courage to fight for her in front of everyone who mattered. The house felt different when they returned that night, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of noise and everything to do with the absence of certainty. Rafael hung his jacket by the door out of habit, watching Luiza climb the stairs ahead of him, her hand trailing along the banister the way it always did, except tonight there was something deliberate in the movement, something that looked almost like goodbye. He found her in the bedroom 20 minutes later, a suitcase open on the bed, half filled with neatly folded clothes. The sight of it hit him harder than anything Beatrice had said at dinner, harder than the memory of Luiza's trembling voice behind that door 3 days earlier. Luiza. Her name came out rough, disbelieving. "What are you doing?" "What does it look like I'm doing?" She didn't stop folding, didn't look up, though her hands moved slower now, as if the weight of the moment had finally caught up to her efficiency. "You can't leave. Not now. Not after everything that happened tonight." He crossed the room, stopping just short of touching her, some instinct telling him she needed the space more than she needed his hands on her shoulders. "I finally said something. I finally stood up for you." "You did." Luiza's voice was steady, but her eyes, when she finally lifted them to his, were glassy with unshed tears. "And I'm grateful, Rafael. I am. But standing up for me once doesn't erase 3 years of not believing me. I know I failed you. I know that. But I'm asking you to give me the chance to fix it." He reached for her hand and she let him take it, though her fingers remained limp in his grip, unresponsive in a way that frightened him more than if she'd pulled away entirely. "I'll move my mother out of every decision that touches our lives. I'll go to therapy. I'll do whatever it takes. I just need you to stay." "Rafael." She pulled her hand back gently, wrapping her arms around herself instead, the gesture small and protective, a habit born from years of needing to hold herself together when no one else would. "I never stopped loving you. I want you to understand that because I think it matters, even now. I didn't stop loving you. Then stay." The word came out desperate, stripped of the composure he usually wore like a second skin. "Please." "I stopped trusting you." Her voice cracked on the word trusting, and for a moment she looked away toward the window, toward the dark shape of the garden below, where she'd spent so many mornings avoiding the house, avoiding Beatrice, avoiding a life that had slowly closed in around her like a fist. "That's different, Rafael. Love doesn't automatically bring trust back with it. I wish it did. God, I wish it worked that way." He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, the suitcase between them like a physical manifestation of everything unraveling. "What can I do? Tell me what to do, and I'll do it." "You can't do anything tonight." Luiza resumed folding, though her movements had slowed further, each piece of clothing handled with a strange, deliberate care, as though she were folding away pieces of the life she'd built here. "This isn't something you fix with a promise. I've heard promises before, Rafael. I've heard I'll talk to her, and that's not the woman I know more times than I can count. This is different. Maybe." She zipped the suitcase closed, the sound final and sharp in the quiet room. "But I need to find that out on my own terms. Not because I'm scared of losing you, not because I'm desperate to keep this marriage together at any cost. I need to know that I can trust you again before I decide what comes next." Rafael stood, moving toward her, close enough now that he could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face, exhaustion that had nothing to do with the late hour, and everything to do with years of carrying a weight she'd never been allowed to set down. "Where will you go?" "My sister's for now." Luiza lifted the suitcase from the bed, her wine-red dress from earlier, now replaced by simple jeans and a soft yellow sweater, the fabric warm against the cool tension of the room. "I need space, Rafael, not forever maybe, but right now. I love you." The words came out raw, unguarded, nothing like the composed businessman who ran boardrooms and closed deals with unwavering confidence. Here, in this room, he was simply a man watching his marriage walk out the door, understanding too late what silence and blind trust in the wrong person had cost him. "I know." Luiza paused at the doorway, suitcase in hand, and turned back to look at him one last time. Her eyes were wet now, finally, the composure she'd held through dinner beginning to crack in the privacy of their bedroom. "Love without protection becomes abandonment, Rafael. I spent 3 years being abandoned by the person who was supposed to protect me. I need to see, really see, that you understand the difference, not just tonight but every day before I can come home." She left him standing there, the echo of her footsteps fading down the stairs, the front door closing with a soft, devastating click that felt louder than anything Beatrice had ever said at that dinner table. Rafael sat alone in the silence of a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty, understanding with a clarity that came far too late that he hadn't just lost an argument or disappointed his wife for one evening. He had lost her trust across 3 years of small failures, and no single act of courage, however sincere, could undo that kind of damage overnight. He picked up his phone, staring at her contact photo for a long moment before setting it back down. Whatever came next would require more than words. It would require proof, the kind of proof that could only be built one day, one choice, one act of unwavering loyalty at a time. 3 weeks passed before Rafael made his first real decision, not the kind born from panic or desperation, but the kind that required sitting alone with himself long enough to understand exactly what needed to change. He signed the lease on a modest one-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city, far from the house on Maple Ridge Avenue, far from Beatrice's influence, far from everything familiar and comfortable. His mother had called 17 times in those 3 weeks. He'd answered exactly 3 of them. "This is absurd," Beatrice said during their last conversation, her voice sharp through the phone. "You're throwing away everything for a woman who couldn't even fight for this marriage, who ran at the first sign of difficulty." "She didn't run, man." Rafael stood at the window of his new apartment, watching traffic crawl along the street below. The space around him still mostly bare. A few boxes, a mattress on the floor, none of the polish of the life he'd built. "She survived 3 years of you making her feel like she didn't belong. I'm the one who ran every single time I chose not to believe her. So this is my fault now? I'm not interested in assigning blame anymore. I'm interested in fixing what I broke." He'd hung up after that, something in his chest settling into place for the first time in weeks, the strange, uncomfortable peace of finally choosing a side and refusing to abandon it. The decisions came steadily after that. He removed Beatrice from her advisory position within the company, a role she'd held more out of tradition than function, informing her calmly that family and business could no longer be so tightly intertwined when one so easily poisoned the other. He began seeing a therapist twice a week, sitting in an unfamiliar office with beige walls, forcing himself to answer questions he'd spent his whole life avoiding. "Why do you think you never believed her?" Dr. Alvarez asked during their 4th session, her tone gentle but unrelenting. Rafael sat with the question longer than he wanted to. "Because believing her meant admitting my mother was capable of real cruelty. And if I admitted that, I'd have to admit that the woman who raised me alone, who sacrificed everything, was also someone who hurt the person I loved most. It was easier to believe Luiza was exaggerating." "Easier for you," Dr. Alvarez said quietly. "Not for her." The words settled into him like stones, heavy and undeniable. He carried them with him through every session after that, through every quiet evening spent alone in his sparse apartment, through every moment he resisted the urge to call Luiza just to hear her voice, understanding that space, right now, was the only gift he could actually give her. Luiza, meanwhile, had begun rebuilding a version of herself she barely recognized. At her sister's apartment, surrounded by mismatched furniture and the comforting chaos of Marina's 2 young children, she found herself waking each morning without the familiar dread that had colored her mornings on Maple Ridge Avenue. She dusted off her old portfolio, architectural sketches she hadn't touched in years, abandoned when marriage and Beatrice's constant scrutiny had slowly consumed every hour she once spent designing. "You're really doing this?" Marina asked one evening, watching Luiza spread blueprints across the kitchen table, papers overflowing onto the floor in organized chaos. "I don't know what I'm doing exactly." Luiza laughed, though there was something genuine in it now, something that had been missing for a long time. But I know I stopped being myself somewhere in that house. I'd like to find her again. She reached out to her old firm the following week, tentative at first, unsure whether 3 years away had erased whatever talent she once possessed. But her former mentor, Diego, welcomed her back with an enthusiasm that startled her, handing her a project within days. A community center renovation that demanded exactly the kind of creative problem-solving she'd once loved. Working late into the evenings, sketching and revising, Luiza felt something unfamiliar unfurl in her chest. Pride. Not the careful, guarded pride of surviving another day in Beatrice's house, but something expansive and hers alone, built from her own hands and her own mind, owing nothing to anyone else's approval. She thought of Rafael more often than she wanted to admit, not with anger anymore, but with a complicated tenderness that she didn't fully trust. She heard through mutual acquaintances about the apartment, the removed position at the company, the therapy sessions he attended without fail. She heard that Beatrice had grown increasingly bitter, increasingly isolated, as Rafael continued distancing himself from her influence. Part of Luiza wanted to believe it all meant something real. But another part, the part that had learned caution the hard way, reminded her that change proven over 3 weeks meant very little compared to 3 years of silence. One evening, sitting alone with her sketches spread before her, her phone buzzed with a text from Rafael, the first he'd sent in over a week, respecting the distance she'd asked for. "I'm not asking you to come back. I just want you to know I'm becoming someone worth coming back to, if that's ever something you want." Luiza stared at the message for a long time, her thumb hovering over the screen, unsure what to say, unsure if she was ready to say anything at all. She set the phone down without responding, returning to her sketches, though her mind lingered on his words far longer than she intended. Somewhere across the city, in a sparse apartment still smelling faintly of fresh paint, Rafael stared at his phone too, watching the message remain unanswered, understanding that this, the waiting, the uncertainty, the slow and patient work of becoming someone deserving, was only the beginning of a much longer road ahead. Beatrice Montero was not a woman accustomed to losing. For 61 years, she had navigated every obstacle in her life through sheer force of will. Widowhood, financial hardship, the slow and deliberate climb to social relevance she'd orchestrated after her husband's accident left her to raise Rafael alone, losing her position within the company, losing her son's unwavering loyalty, losing the quiet control she'd exercised over Maple Ridge Avenue for years. These were not defeats she intended to accept gracefully. She began carefully, the way she did everything. A lunch here, a phone call there, seeds planted among old friends and business acquaintances who still respected the Montero name enough to listen when Beatrice spoke. "It's such a shame," she told a longtime family friend over coffee, her voice heavy with practiced sorrow. "Rafael built everything from nothing, and now this woman has convinced him to tear it all apart, removing his own mother from the company, of all things. I fear she's after more than just his heart." The rumors moved slowly at first, the way poison often does. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there, until whispers began circulating among shareholders and old family friends that Luiza had somehow manipulated Rafael during a moment of emotional vulnerability, positioning herself to benefit from whatever came next in the divorce, should it come to that. Rafael heard the first version of the rumor from an old business partner, delivered with the careful diplomacy of someone unsure how much truth it contained. "Just something I heard around, Rafael. People are saying your wife pushed for you to remove Beatrice from the board rather suddenly. Some folks are wondering if there's more to it, financial motives, that sort of thing." The accusation landed like a blow, old instincts flaring to life before he could stop them, the familiar, dangerous pull toward doubt, toward wondering if perhaps there was some truth buried in his mother's version of events. He caught himself mid-thought, recognizing the pattern immediately, the same reflexive doubt that had cost him 3 years of his marriage. He didn't confront Luiza. He didn't call his mother in anger either. Instead, for the first time in his life, he decided to investigate before concluding anything. He spent 2 days quietly reviewing the company's financial records, tracing Luiza's actual involvement, or lack thereof, in any decisions related to the board. He found nothing. No requests, no pressure, no indication that she'd ever asked him to remove Beatrice from anything. The decision had been entirely his own, born from 3 weeks of therapy and hard, uncomfortable self-reflection. He tracked the rumor's origin next, calling colleagues, asking careful questions, until the trail led exactly where some quiet part of him had already suspected it would. Back to his mother, back to a series of calculated lunches and phone calls designed to paint Luiza as a manipulative opportunist, rather than a woman who had simply endured years of cruelty in silence. The confirmation didn't bring him satisfaction. It brought something heavier, a grief for the mother he'd hoped might change, tangled with a clarity he couldn't unsee. He called Beatrice that evening, his voice controlled, but unmistakably firm. "I know what you've been doing, mine. The rumors, the lunches, the calls to shareholders. I don't know what you're talking about." Her denial came too quickly, too smooth, the same practiced tone she'd used for years to deflect accusations she couldn't quite escape. "I traced it back to you. Every version of that story leads back to conversations you had over the past 2 weeks." He kept his voice level, though something inside him ached with the effort. "I need you to understand something. I'm not the same man who walked away from that dinner 3 weeks ago believing you might change. I investigate now before I judge, and every time I investigate I find you at the center of it." Beatrice's composure finally cracked, her voice rising with genuine desperation now. "I'm trying to save this family, Rafael. That woman is going to destroy everything we've built. She's not destroying anything." His voice remained calm, though something final had settled into it, something Beatrice had never heard from her son before. "You are. Every time you try to manipulate the people around me instead of simply apologizing for what you did, you push me further away. I'm done investigating your version of events, man. I know the truth now, and I intend to protect it." He ended the call without waiting for a response, sitting alone in his apartment as the last light of evening faded from the windows, understanding that trust, real trust, required exactly this: the discipline to listen fully before drawing conclusions, the willingness to seek truth even when it implicated someone he loved. Across the city, Luiza had heard fragments of the rumors too, filtered through Marina, who'd heard them from a friend still connected to the old social circles Beatrice moved through. She'd expected to feel angry. Instead, she felt a strange, exhausted resignation, the familiar weight of being cast as the villain in a story she'd never asked to be part of. What surprised her, when Rafael called that same evening, wasn't the apology he offered. She'd grown almost numb to apologies by now, but the specific detail he shared, that he hadn't simply believed her innocence out of loyalty, but had actually investigated, actually traced the rumors to their source, actually done the work of separating truth from his mother's manipulation. "I didn't ask you to defend yourself to me," Rafael said quietly over the phone. "I did the work myself because I owed you that much. I owed you 3 years of that much." Luiza sat with the phone pressed to her ear for a long moment, watching the city lights flicker outside Marina's window, something in her chest shifting slightly, cautiously, toward a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in weeks. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. "That matters more than you probably realize." She didn't say more than that. She wasn't ready to say more than that. But somewhere in the quiet after their call ended, Luiza allowed herself, just briefly, to wonder whether the man rebuilding himself across the city might actually become someone she could trust again, even as some deeper, more cautious part of her continued watching from a careful distance, unwilling to be hurt the same way twice. The community center renovation had become the center of Luiza's world in ways she hadn't anticipated. Late nights bent over blueprints, site visits in the early morning light, conversations with contractors about load-bearing walls and window placements. It had given her something she'd been missing for years, a sense of purpose entirely her own, untethered from anyone else's approval. She hadn't expected Rafael to show up at the site. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the sun cutting sharp angles across the half-finished building, dust hanging in the air from ongoing construction. Luiza stood with Diego, discussing a structural adjustment to the east wing, when she noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance, hands in his pockets, watching quietly from a respectful distance. "Rafael." She said his name carefully, unsure whether to feel surprised or wary. "What are you doing here?" "I heard from Marina you were presenting the final designs to the city council this week." He stepped closer, though not too close, keeping the space between them that had become an unspoken agreement over the past month. "I wanted to see the work you've been so passionate about, if that's all right." Diego glanced between them, offering a diplomatic excuse about checking on the contractors, before disappearing toward the far end of the site, leaving them alone amid the scaffolding and exposed beams. "It's all right." Luiza crossed her arms, though the gesture felt less defensive than it once might have, more contemplative. "This project means a lot to me." "I can tell." Rafael looked around at the half-built walls, the blueprints pinned to a makeshift board nearby. "You look different here, lighter somehow." "I feel different." She allowed herself a small, genuine smile, the first she'd offered him freely in weeks. "I'd forgotten how much I loved this work. How much I loved feeling capable of something entirely my own." They walked slowly through the site together, Luiza explaining details of the design, the community garden planned for the courtyard, the flexible classroom spaces designed to serve everyone from toddlers to seniors, the deliberate use of natural light throughout the building. Rafael listened, really listened, asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation, something Luiza noticed with quiet surprise. "You used to do this," he said eventually, as they stood near a window overlooking the unfinished garden. "Before we got married, you'd talk about buildings the way other people talk about music, like every detail mattered, like the space itself could hold emotion." "I forgot how to talk about it that way," Luiza admitted, her voice softer now. "For a while I forgot how to talk about anything that wasn't survival." Rafael's jaw tightened, though he didn't look away from her. "I know. I know that's on me." "It's not entirely on you." She turned to face him fully, the late afternoon light catching the soft yellow blouse she wore, warm against the grey dust of the construction site. "I let myself disappear too, Rafael. I stopped fighting for space in my own life long before you finally saw what was happening. Can I ask you something?" His voice carried a careful hesitance she wasn't used to hearing from him. "You can ask. Do you think there's still a version of us worth fighting for? Or am I holding on to something that's already gone?" The question hung between them, heavier than the dust in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Luiza looked out over the half-finished courtyard, considering her answer with the same careful precision she brought to every design decision on this project. "I don't know yet," she said finally, honestly. "But I notice things now that I didn't notice a month ago. I notice that you're here, not asking me to come back, just showing up, watching, listening. I promised myself I wouldn't pressure you." Rafael's hands remained in his pockets, though something in his posture had softened. "I just wanted you to know I'm still here, still doing the work, whether or not it leads anywhere you want to go." They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, the construction noise fading into background static around them, two people occupying the same space without the weight of expectation crushing the air between them. "There's a council meeting Thursday," Luiza said eventually. "I'm presenting the final designs. It's nothing dramatic, just numbers and blueprints, but..." She hesitated, surprising herself with what she was about to say. "You could come if you wanted, as a friend, nothing more than that." Something shifted in Rafael's expression. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but something quieter, more grateful. "I'd like that. Thank you for asking." As he turned to leave, pausing at the edge of the site to look back at her one final time, Luiza felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not the old ache of longing, not the sharp caution she'd carried for weeks, but something gentler, more tentative. A small, careful opening in a door she'd kept firmly closed. She watched his car disappear down the street before turning back to her blueprints, her fingers tracing the outline of the community garden she'd designed, aware that something had shifted between them today, however small, however fragile. That night, alone in her sister's guest room, Luiza found herself staring at the ceiling long after the house had gone quiet, replaying the conversation, the careful way Rafael had listened without needing anything from her in return. For years, she had waited for a man who would listen more than he spoke, who would show up without demanding, who would let her rebuild herself without rushing the process. She wasn't certain yet whether Rafael had truly become that man. But for the first time since she'd packed that suitcase, she found herself wondering, quietly, cautiously, whether the answer might actually be yes. The call came on a Sunday morning, Rafael's voice tight with a panic Luiza had never heard from him before. "It's my father. He collapsed at the house this morning and they think it's his heart. I'm heading to the hospital now." Luiza didn't hesitate. She grabbed her keys before she'd even fully processed the decision, driving across town with her heart pounding, arriving at the hospital just as Rafael paced the sterile hallway outside the ICU, his usually composed demeanor stripped away entirely, replaced by raw, unguarded fear. "Luiza," he looked up when she appeared, something breaking open in his expression. Surprise, relief, gratitude, all tangled together. "You didn't have to come." "I know." She stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I wanted to." They sat together in the uncomfortable plastic chairs of the waiting room for hours. Rafael's father, Antonio, a quiet, gentle man who had always treated Luiza with a warmth entirely absent in his wife, undergoing emergency tests to determine the extent of the damage. Beatriz arrived an hour later, her usual composure fractured by genuine terror, and for the first time since Luiza had known her, she looked less like a woman calculating her next move and more like a wife frightened of losing her husband. Something shifted in that hospital hallway over the following days. Luiza found herself returning each morning, not out of obligation, but because some quiet, persistent part of her still cared for Antonio, who had always been kind to her, and, she was beginning to admit, for Rafael, who sat beside his father's bed each evening, looking more exhausted and more human than she'd ever seen him. "You don't have to keep coming," Rafael told her on the third day, finding her in the hospital cafeteria with 2 cups of coffee, one already set aside for him. "I know." She slid the cup across the table. "I'm not doing it out of obligation, Rafael. I'm doing it because your father was always decent to me and because—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Because some part of me still cares what happens to you. That hasn't gone away, even with everything that happened." Rafael wrapped his hands around the warm cup, watching her with an expression that held none of the desperation from weeks earlier, only quiet, grateful acknowledgement. "Thank you. For being here. For all of it." Over the following 2 weeks, as Antonio slowly recovered, Luiza and Rafael settled into an unexpected rhythm, coordinating hospital visits, sharing updates, occasionally sitting together in comfortable silence in the waiting room while Antonio slept. They laughed together for the first time in months, over a shared memory of Antonio's terrible cooking attempts, the sound of it surprising them both, familiar and strange all at once. One evening, as they walked to the parking garage together after visiting hours ended, Rafael slowed his pace, hesitating near his car. "Can I ask you something? And you can say no. You can ask." Luiza pulled her cardigan tighter against the cool evening air, a deep red the color of late autumn leaves. "Would you want to get dinner sometime? Not as part of hospital visits, not because of any crisis. Just dinner, as whatever we are right now." Luiza considered the question longer than the moment probably required, watching Rafael's face carefully, the hope he wasn't quite hiding, the restraint he'd clearly learned not to push too hard. "I'd like that," she said finally. "I think I would." They met 3 days later at a small restaurant neither of them had been to before, neutral ground, unfamiliar and free of old memories. The conversation flowed easier than either of them expected, not forced, not weighted with the careful negotiations of the past weeks, but genuinely warm, filled with the kind of laughter that had once come naturally between them before everything unraveled. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Rafael admitted over dessert, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "About love without protection becoming abandonment. I think about it every single day. And I understand it now in a way I didn't before, really understand it." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, leaving the choice entirely hers. If it takes me the rest of my life to prove that to you, every single day, without complaint, I'll do it. I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. I'm asking you to let me keep showing you for as long as it takes." Luiza looked down at his hand resting on the table, then slowly, deliberately, placed her own hand over it. The gesture felt enormous in its simplicity. Not a promise, not a resolution, just a small, honest acknowledgement of where they stood. "I'm not ready to come home yet," she said softly, meeting his eyes. "But I'm here right now with you. And that feels like something real." Rafael's fingers curled gently around hers, his eyes glistening with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "That's enough for me. For now, that's more than enough." They sat together in the soft glow of the restaurant, the tension between them finally loosening into something warmer, something that felt less like a negotiation and more like the tentative beginning of trust rebuilding itself, one small gesture at a time. Walking her to her car afterward, Rafael paused, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. He didn't reach for her, didn't push for anything more than what she'd already offered. Instead, he simply said, "Good night, Luiza," his voice carrying a tenderness that felt entirely new, entirely earned. She drove home that night with something unfamiliar blooming quietly in her chest. Not the reckless hope of years ago, but something steadier, more deliberate, the fragile beginning of a love she was slowly, cautiously, allowing herself to believe in again. She had no way of knowing that Beatrice, recovering from the fear of nearly losing her husband, had not yet given up her final attempt to keep them apart, and that attempt was coming sooner than either of them expected. Antonio's recovery brought with it an unexpected demand from Beatrice, a family gathering to celebrate his return home, held at the house on Maple Ridge Avenue, the first time the extended family would gather there since the dinner where Rafael had defended Luiza in front of everyone. Rafael had hesitated before accepting the invitation, wary of his mother's motives, but Antonio's gentle insistence, "Let an old man have his family around him, just this once," had softened his resistance. Luiza arrived separately, choosing to drive herself, needing the independence of her own car waiting outside in case the evening required a quick exit. She wore a deep amethyst dress, simple and elegant, her hair loose around her shoulders, carrying herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't existed in this house before. The gathering began pleasantly enough. Antonio seated in his favorite armchair, color returned to his face, relatives offering warm greetings and relieved embraces. For nearly an hour the evening felt almost normal, almost peaceful, until Beatrice rose from her seat near the fireplace, her expression carrying the particular composure Rafael had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "I'd like to say something," Beatrice announced, her voice cutting cleanly through the scattered conversations. The room quieted, attention shifting toward her, the way it always did when she chose to command it. "Now that your father is recovering, Rafael, I think it's time we addressed the direction of this family properly." "My." Rafael's voice carried a warning, though Beatrice continued undeterred. "This family has traditions, values that have carried us through generations, that built everything you now enjoy. I've watched you dismantle those traditions piece by piece over the past 2 months, removing me from the company, distancing yourself from decisions that should remain within the family, all because of choices made in the heat of emotion." She turned, her gaze settling directly on Luiza, cold and deliberate. "I'm asking you, in front of everyone who matters to this family, to choose. Choose the traditions that built this family's name, or choose her." The room fell into stunned silence, relatives exchanging uncomfortable glances, Antonio's expression tightening with something between disappointment and exhaustion, as though he'd hoped, even now, that his wife might have learned something from nearly losing him. Luiza's stomach dropped, old instincts screaming at her to retreat, to disappear quietly the way she always had in this house, but she remained still, watching Rafael, waiting. Rafael set down his glass with deliberate care, rising slowly to his feet, his eyes never leaving his mother's face. "You want me to choose between tradition and Luiza." His voice was steady, carrying none of the hesitation that had once defined every difficult conversation between them. "All right, I choose." The room held its breath. I choose a family that doesn't require someone to endure years of cruelty just to earn the right to belong. His voice grew stronger with each word, carrying clearly across the silent room. I choose a marriage where my wife isn't diminished daily in her own home while everyone around her stays silent to preserve appearances. If that means breaking whatever tradition you're referring to, then I break it. Gladly. You're choosing her over your own family, Beatrice said, her voice trembling now, though whether from anger or genuine hurt, Rafael could no longer tell. I'm choosing to end a cycle that should have ended a long time ago. He stepped closer to her, his voice softening slightly, though the resolve behind it remained absolute. Family should never require someone to accept abuse in exchange for belonging, mine. That's not tradition. That's harm dressed up in inheritance and old photographs. Beatrice's composure finally shattered entirely, tears spilling freely now, though Rafael no longer flinched at the sight of them the way he once might have. Everything I did to protect this family's legacy. You did it to maintain control, Rafael said quietly without cruelty, simply stating a truth he'd spent months learning to see clearly. And I understand, maybe, why you needed that control after everything you survived raising me alone. But I won't let that need cost Luiza another single day of her life. He turned then, crossing the room toward Luiza, who stood frozen near the window, watching him with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something warmer, something that looked dangerously close to hope. He didn't reach for her hand, didn't demand any public gesture from her. He simply stood beside her, a quiet, deliberate declaration that required no further words. I'm sorry, Beatrice said eventually, her voice small now, stripped of its usual command, directed not at Rafael but for the first time toward Luiza herself. I don't know if that means anything anymore, but I am sorry. Luiza studied her for a long moment, searching for sincerity beneath years of practiced cruelty, uncertain whether she'd ever fully trust the apology, but recognizing at least the significance of it being offered at all. Thank you for saying that, she said quietly, offering nothing more, needing nothing more in this moment. Antonio, watching from his armchair, reached for his wife's hand as she sank back into her seat, his quiet presence the only comfort she seemed willing to accept. The room slowly returned to hushed conversation, relatives processing what they'd witnessed, the balance of power within the Montero family fundamentally altered in the space of a few devastating minutes. Later, walking Luiza to her car beneath a sky scattered with early stars, Rafael finally allowed himself to exhale, the tension of the evening slowly draining from his shoulders. I meant every word in there, he said quietly. I know. Luiza turned to face him, her eyes searching his with a careful, cautious warmth. I watched you mean it, Rafael. That's different from just hearing it. She reached up, her fingers brushing gently against his jaw. A small, tender gesture that carried more weight than any declaration could have. Rafael closed his eyes briefly at the touch, leaning into it, understanding without words that something fundamental had shifted between them tonight. Does this mean, he began, but Luiza pressed a finger gently to his lips, silencing the question before he could finish it. It means I'm no longer certain the answer is no, she said softly, a small tremulous smile breaking across her face. Give me a little more time, Rafael. I think we're almost there. 6 weeks passed after the night Beatrice demanded Rafael choose. 6 weeks of small dinners, quiet phone calls, careful conversations that slowly rebuilt what 3 years of silence had worn away. Luiza kept her own apartment now. She'd moved out of Marina's guest room into a small place near the community center, close enough to her work, far enough to remain entirely her own. It was there, on a quiet Thursday evening with rain tapping softly against the windows, that Rafael arrived unannounced, holding nothing but a single folder in his hands. I'm not here to ask you to come home, he said, standing in her doorway, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. I know we're not there yet. I just wanted to show you something. Luiza let him in, curious despite herself, watching as he set the folder down on her kitchen table. Inside were papers, legal documents, formally signed, transferring full and permanent control of specific company decisions away from Beatrice, codifying in writing everything he'd promised in the weeks since that dinner. Beneath them, a second document. His enrollment confirmation for a full year of ongoing therapy. Not the token weeks he'd already completed, but a genuine, sustained commitment. "I'm not showing you this to convince you of anything," Rafael said quietly, watching her study the papers. "I just wanted you to see that this isn't temporary. This isn't something I'll abandon once things feel comfortable again." Luiza looked up at him, something in her chest finally, fully releasing after months of careful guardedness. "Rafael, I love you," he said simply, the words carrying none of the desperation of months earlier, only quiet, steady certainty. "I'm not asking you to erase what happened. I'm asking for the chance to build something new with you, slowly, on whatever terms you need." She was quiet for a long moment, the rain filling the silence between them, before she finally spoke. "I don't want to go back to who we were before, Rafael. I don't want the version of us that existed in that house, where I disappeared a little more every single day. Neither do I." He stepped closer, close enough now that she could see the sincerity etched into every line of his face. "I want something different, something we actually build together, with rules that protect both of us this time." Luiza reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, slowly, deliberately. "Then let's start there, not moving back into that house, somewhere new, somewhere that's entirely ours. And when your mother crosses a line, because she will eventually, you don't wait 3 years to believe me. You believe me immediately." "I promise." His voice cracked slightly on the word, emotion breaking through his composure. "Every single time. Immediately." They found a small house 8 weeks later, nothing like the grand estate on Maple Ridge Avenue. A modest 2-story home with a garden Luiza could design herself, windows that caught the morning light in a way that felt like a fresh beginning rather than an inherited legacy. There were no portraits of ancestors in the hallway, no rooms weighted down by years of silent suffering, just empty walls waiting to be filled with a story that belonged to no one but them. Moving day arrived on a bright autumn afternoon, boxes scattered across bare floors, sunlight pouring through uncovered windows. Luiza stood in the middle of what would become their living room, watching Rafael carry in the last of the boxes, sleeves rolled up, laughing at something Marina had said from the doorway. It was such a simple, ordinary moment, nothing dramatic, nothing that demanded attention, and yet Luiza felt something settle deep in her chest, a quiet certainty she hadn't trusted herself to feel in years. "You look happy," Marina said later, finding her sister alone in the kitchen unpacking a box of mismatched mugs. "I think I am," Luiza admitted, turning one of the mugs over in her hands. "Not the same happy I felt when we first got married. This feels different, steadier." "Earned," Marina offered, and Luiza nodded because that was exactly the word for it. They didn't rush the wedding. Luiza had been firm about that from the beginning. No elaborate ceremony, no grand renewal of vows performed for an audience of relatives who had once stayed silent through years of her suffering. Instead, they planned something small and intimate, held in the garden of their new home just months after moving in, once the roses Luiza had planted herself had finally begun to bloom. Only 20 guests attended, Marina and her children, Diego from the firm, a handful of relatives who had genuinely shown Luiza kindness over the years, and quietly in the back row, Antonio, seated in a chair with a soft blanket over his knees, his health still fragile, but his presence steady and warm. Beatrice was invited too, though her attendance came with no guarantees, no expectations. She sat beside her husband, uncharacteristically quiet, watching the ceremony unfold with an expression Luiza couldn't quite read, something that might have been regret, or perhaps finally something closer to humility. Rafael stood beneath a simple wooden arch strung with soft yellow and rose-colored ribbons, watching Luiza walk toward him in a deep amethyst dress, her hair loose and unadorned, carrying nothing but a small bouquet of wildflowers. There was no elaborate procession, no orchestrated grandeur, just the quiet, deliberate choice of 2 people who had rebuilt something broken, piece by careful piece. "I don't have new vows prepared," Rafael said when it came time to speak, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. "Because everything I need to say, I've already been saying for months, through actions rather than words. But I want you to know, standing here, that I understand now what I didn't understand 3 years ago. Love isn't just a feeling you carry quietly. It's a daily choice to protect, to listen, to believe someone before you judge them. You taught me that, Luiza, even when I didn't deserve to learn it. Luiza's eyes glistened, though she smiled through the emotion, steady and sure in a way that would have been impossible months earlier. I used to believe some stories only survive because they never fall apart, she said softly. I don't believe that anymore. I think the strongest stories are the ones that do fall apart, completely, and still find a way to be rebuilt, not by one person trying harder, but by 2 people choosing, every single day, to show up for each other differently than before. She reached for his hands, steady now, sure. I choose you, Rafael. Not the man you were 3 years ago, the man you've become. The small gathering erupted into quiet applause, and as Rafael leaned in to kiss her beneath the wooden arch, the autumn light catching gently in her hair, Luiza felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, the quiet, unshakable certainty of being truly, fully seen. Not as a placeholder, not as someone temporarily occupying a space she hadn't earned, but as an equal partner in something real, something chosen deliberately, every single day. Later that evening, as the small gathering wound down and guests began drifting home, Luiza found a quiet moment alone in the garden, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the trees. Rafael joined her there, wrapping his jacket gently around her shoulders against the cooling evening air. "No regrets?" he asked softly, watching her carefully. "None," she said, leaning into him, watching the first stars emerge above their new home. Some stories don't survive because they never break, Rafael. They survive because 2 people choose, again and again, to put the pieces back together, a little wiser, a little more honest, every single time. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, holding her close beneath the darkening sky, both of them understanding, finally, that the marriage they were building now bore little resemblance to the one that had nearly ended in a suitcase packed hastily on a devastating night months earlier. This one was slower, steadier, built not on blind trust but on trust genuinely earned, day by day, choice by choice, for as long as they both continued choosing it. Before we begin, I need to tell you something. I created Allure TV especially for those of you who follow me here, and there's content on there that this platform would never allow. Uncensored stories, with no cuts and no ads. You'll find everything: steamy stories, mafia stories, billionaire romances, and many more genres that you're going to love. There's new content every day for you to listen to in multiple languages, or read whenever you prefer. This channel no longer generates any revenue for me, but I have an amazing team that works hard every week for all of you. The people who join Allure TV are the ones who keep all of this alive, and they get a lot in return. The link is pinned in the comments, or you can simply point your camera at the QR code on the screen. May God bless each and every one of you, wishing you many blessings in your lives.